If you happened to live in Montreal, Canada, back in the 1970s or 80s, you might have called a plumber to fix a leaky pipe in your basement. And if you were lucky, the man who showed up might have been a quiet, unassuming guy named Léo. He was a pipe fitter by trade, a family man, and by all accounts, a pretty regular guy. The only thing that might have caught your attention was that he had a distinct, rugged look about him, and he was missing an eye. If you asked him how he lost it, he might have brushed it off or given you a vague answer about the war. He wasn't the type to brag. He wasn't the type to stand on a soapbox and demand attention. But if that old pipe fitter had decided to actually tell you the truth, you probably wouldn't have believed him. You would have thought he was pulling your leg. You would have thought he was reciting the plot of an unreleased Rambo movie or a Captain America comic book. But Léo Major was not a comic book character. He was flesh and blood, and the story of how he lost that eye is just the opening chapter of the most insane, improbable, and downright legendary one-man rampage in the history of World War II. We are talking about a man who was told he was crippled, who was ordered to go home, and who responded by single-handedly capturing an entire German garrison and liberating a major European city without a single tank or artillery shell to back him up. This is the story of the man the Nazis couldn't kill, the man the British generals couldn't control, and the man who proved that sometimes an army of one is all you really need. To understand how a man becomes a myth, we have to go back to the beginning. The date is June 6th, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The Allies are storming the beaches of Normandy, throwing themselves into the teeth of the German war machine to break the grip of fascism on Europe. Among the thousands of terrified, seasick, and adrenaline-fueled young men storming Juno Beach was Léo Major, a soldier with the Regiment de la Chaudière. Now, Léo wasn't your typical soldier. He was a French-Canadian from Quebec, and if you know anything about the history of the Canadian military, you know that the Quebecois soldiers had a bit of a reputation. They were fierce, they were independent, and they didn't particularly care for the stiff upper lip and the rigid rules of their English-speaking officers. Léo embodied this spirit perfectly. He was wild, he was aggressive, and he had a serious problem with authority. But he was also exceptionally good at violence. While most soldiers were terrified of what lay beyond the beaches, Léo seemed to thrive in the chaos. He wasn't interested in sitting in a trench and waiting for orders. He volunteered for the Scouts, and you have to understand, being a scout in World War II was basically a suicide pact. Your job wasn't to fight in a line with your buddies. Your job was to go out alone, or in pairs, deep behind enemy lines. You had to sneak through forests crawling with SS soldiers, pinpoint their machine gun nests, map their bunkers, and then, if you were lucky, sneak back to tell the artillery where to shoot. It was a game of high-stakes hide-and-seek where the seeker had a flamethrower, but Léo treated it like a sport. Just days after the landing, Léo gave his unit a taste of what he was capable of. He was out on a solo patrol when he spotted a German Hanomag, an armoured half-track vehicle, loaded with secret communication equipment and codes. Now, the protocol for a scout in this situation is simple. Observe, record, and retreat. You do not engage a tank with a rifle. That is a quick way to die. Léo Major didn't care about protocol. He saw an opportunity. He ambushed the vehicle, killed the driver, and single-handedly captured the half-track. He drove it back to the Allied lines with the secret code still inside. It was an intelligence goldmine. It was the kind of feat that usually wins a soldier a medal and a ticket to a safer job. But for Léo, it was just a Tuesday. But war has a way of balancing the scales. You can't run on luck forever. A few weeks later, Léo's luck ran into a wall. During a skirmish with SS troops, some of the most fanatical and well-trained soldiers in the German army, Léo was hit. But he wasn't hit by a bullet. An incendiary grenade, likely filled with white phosphorus, exploded near him. If you don't know what white phosphorus does, count yourself lucky. It is a horrific chemical weapon. It doesn't just burn, it sticks to the skin and burns all the way down to the bone. You can't put it out with water. It just keeps burning. One of the fragments from that explosion struck Léo in the face. It destroyed his left eye. The pain must have been excruciating. He was rushed to the field hospital, blood pouring down his face, the smell of burning chemical filling the air. The doctors took one look at him and made the logical call. They told him the war was over for him. He was blind in one eye. He had done his duty. It was time to go back to Canada, receive his disability pension, and live out the rest of his days in peace. Most men would have taken that ticket home. But Léo Major was not most men. He looked at the doctor with his one good eye, blood still drying on his cheek, and he got angry. He didn't see himself as a victim. He saw the injury as an inconvenience. He reportedly told the medical officer that he didn't need two eyes to fight. He said, "I aim with my right eye, so I don't see what the problem is." The doctors insisted. They tried to process his discharge papers. So Léo did the only logical thing a man like him could do. He escaped. He literally walked out of the field hospital, put on an eye patch, and hitchhiked his way back to his unit. He looked like a pirate. He acted like a madman, and when he showed up back at camp, telling his commanding officer that he was ready for duty, nobody had the heart, or perhaps the guts, to tell him no. He declared that he looked like a pirate, so he might as well fight like one. And that is exactly what he did. The loss of his eye didn't make him more cautious. It made him more focused. It was as if the pain had sharpened his senses. He returned to his role as a scout, moving like a ghost through the ruined villages of France and Belgium. But the universe wasn't done testing him yet, because what happened next, just a short time later during the Battle of the Scheldt, would make capturing a half-track look like child's play. This is where the legend of Léo Major stops being a war story and starts sounding like a myth. This is where the one-eyed pirate decides that capturing one German soldier is boring, so he might as well try to capture an entire army. If Normandy was a baptism by fire, the Battle of the Scheldt was a slow drowning in mud. By the fall of 1944, the Canadian army found themselves bogged down in the Netherlands and northern Belgium. The terrain was a nightmare. It was flat, flooded, and freezing. The Germans had blown the dikes, turning the battlefield into a soup of icy water and sticky clay. It was the kind of place where tanks sank, morale died, and soldiers simply disappeared into the grey mist. But for a predator like Léo Major, this was a playground. The cold didn't bother him. The mud didn't slow him down. And that eye patch he was wearing, it was starting to become a symbol that terrified the Germans just as much as it confused his own officers. It was a cold, wet morning when Léo was sent out on what was supposed to be a recovery mission. A group of fresh recruits, green kids who had barely seen combat, had been sent out on patrol and hadn't come back. The commanding officer feared the worst, and he sent his best man to find out what happened. Léo moved out, alone, sliding through the ditches and tall grass like a phantom. He didn't find the recruits, at least not yet. What he found instead were two German soldiers walking along a dike, probably looking for a dry spot to smoke a cigarette. Now, a normal soldier would have shot them from a distance. A smart soldier might have let them pass to avoid alerting the main force. Léo decided to do something completely different. He snuck up behind them, jammed his pistol into one guy's ribs, and quietly informed them that they were now his prisoners. But Léo wasn't interested in just two prisoners. He noticed that one of the Germans was carrying a bag of supplies, which meant he was running items back to a larger group. Léo had a crazy idea. He wasn't going to drag these two back to base. He was going to use them as bait. He forced one of the Germans to walk back towards his own officer, while Léo stayed hidden in the shadows, his weapon trained on them. When the German soldier approached his commanding officer to report, Léo stepped out of the darkness. Imagine the scene. You are a German officer. Suddenly, a wild-looking Canadian with an eye patch steps out of the gloom, pointing a machine gun at you. He isn't screaming. He isn't panicking. He looks calm, dangerously calm. Léo looked the officer dead in the eye and lied. He lied with the confidence of a man holding a royal flush. He told the officer that he was just the advanced scout for a massive Canadian assault force. He pointed into the fog and said, "Look, my tanks are already moving into position. My artillery has your coordinates locked in. If you don't surrender right now, every single one of you will be blown to pieces in 10 minutes." It was a complete fabrication. There were no tanks, there was no artillery, there was just Léo, standing in the mud with a submachine gun and an attitude problem. But you have to understand the psychology of the German army at this point in the war. These men had been fighting for years. They were exhausted. They knew the Allies had superior firepower, and when a man this confident tells you that you are about to die, you believe him. The German officer hesitated. He looked at his men. He looked at Léo, and then he made the call. But the story doesn't end there. It actually gets crazier. As Léo began to round up the soldiers, dozens of them emerging from their foxholes and bunkers. Chaos broke out. A separate group of SS soldiers, positioned nearby, saw the regular German army troops surrendering. The SS were the fanatics, the diehards. They were furious. They opened fire, not on Léo, but on their own surrendering countrymen. It was absolute madness. The Germans were being shot at by other Germans. In that moment of confusion, Léo Major didn't run. He returned fire. He stood his ground and started engaging the SS troops to protect his prisoners. Think about the irony of that. He was risking his life to save the very men he had just captured. This act of protection sealed the deal. The regular German soldiers realized that this one-eyed Canadian was the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave. They rallied around him. Léo managed to silence the SS threat, and then he began the long march back to the Canadian lines. Picture the view from the Allied trenches. A sentry looks out into the fog and sees a massive column of troops marching toward them. He grabs his radio, panicking, thinking it's a German counterattack. Fingers tighten on triggers. Machine guns are leveled. And then, at the front of the column, they see him. Strutting through the mud, smoking a cigarette, with nearly 100 German soldiers following him like lost ducklings. He didn't just capture a squad. He didn't just capture a platoon. He marched 93 German soldiers into camp single-handedly. The camp went silent. The officers couldn't believe it. They asked him where the rest of his unit was. Léo just shrugged and said, "It's just me." For this act of absolute insanity, the British High Command decided to award Léo Major the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The DCM. It is the second highest award for gallantry in action, just below the Victoria Cross. It is a huge deal. It is the kind of medal you tell your grandkids about. But when Léo found out who was going to pin the medal on his chest, he stopped smiling. The ceremony was to be conducted by General Bernard Montgomery, the top British commander. Montgomery was a hero to the public, but to a lot of common soldiers, and especially to a French-Canadian rebel like Léo, he was seen as pompous, distant, and incompetent. Léo blamed Montgomery's poor planning for the earlier casualties his unit had suffered. So, in a move that is perhaps even more shocking than capturing 93 soldiers, Léo Major refused the medal. He told his superiors, on the record, that General Montgomery was incompetent and that he didn't want a medal from a man who was so careless with soldiers' lives. He literally snubbed one of the most powerful generals in the Allied forces. He walked away from glory because it conflicted with his principles. He stayed a private. He stayed in the mud. He stayed with his friends. And it's a good thing he did. Because while capturing 93 soldiers is impressive, it was just a warm-up. The war was moving north, toward the Netherlands, toward a beautiful, ancient city called Zwolle, and destiny was about to call Léo Major for his masterpiece. By April 1945, the end of the Third Reich was visible on the horizon. The Allies were sweeping through the Netherlands, liberating town after town, but liberation often came at a terrible price. The standard military procedure for taking a city held by entrenched German defenders was brutal but effective. You flatten it with artillery first, and then you send in the infantry to mop up what's left. This was the fate awaiting Zwolle, a picturesque Dutch city with a population of about 50,000 people. The Canadian commanders looked at their maps. They knew the Germans were dug in. They knew fighting street by street would result in heavy Canadian casualties. So, the order was drafted. The heavy artillery was brought forward. Zwolle was going to be shelled into submission. The buildings would be destroyed, and hundreds, perhaps thousands, of innocent civilians were going to die in the crossfire. But down in the trenches, Léo Major heard about the plan, and he hated it. He didn't want to see a city destroyed if it didn't have to be. So, he and his best friend, Corporal Wilfred Arsenault, made a counter-proposal. They volunteered for a reconnaissance mission. They asked their commanding officer to give them just one night. They would sneak into the city, make contact with the Dutch resistance, and see if they could figure out exactly where the Germans were. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to take the city without turning it into a parking lot. The officer agreed, but he probably didn't expect them to come back. As the sun set on April 13th, Léo and Wilfred slipped into the darkness. They were a perfect team. They had survived Normandy, the Scheldt, and months of hell together. They moved toward the city limits, using the shadows of the farmhouses and trees for cover. They reached the outskirts near a railroad track, expecting to find a quiet entry point. Instead, they found an ambush. A German patrol spotted them before they spotted the Germans. Shots rang out in the silence. There was a brief, violent exchange of gunfire. Léo reacted instantly, returning fire and neutralizing the threat. But it was too late. When the smoke cleared, he looked over at his friend. Wilfred Arsenault was down. He had been hit. And just like that, in the mud of a foreign field, Léo's best friend was gone. For a moment, Léo Major stood alone in the dark. He could have turned back. He could have grabbed Wilfred's body, returned to the Canadian lines, and told the artillery to open fire. He could have let the rage consume him and just given up on the city that had cost him his brother in arms. But Léo didn't turn back. And he didn't just get angry. A switch flipped inside his brain. The mission had changed. It was no longer about reconnaissance. It was no longer about contacting the resistance. It was about revenge. But not the kind of revenge where you kill a few guys and go home. Léo decided he was going to take the entire city of Zwolle from the Germans, all by himself, as a tribute to Wilfred. He picked up Wilfred's Sten gun, slung it over his shoulder along with his own, stuffed his pockets with extra magazines and grenades, and walked into the city. What followed is arguably the greatest feat of individual combat in the history of modern warfare. Léo Major didn't just fight the Germans. He gaslit them. He waged a psychological war so intense that he convinced an entire garrison of SS and Wehrmacht troops that they were under attack by a massive Canadian force. Here is how he did it. He started running through the streets like a madman. He would sprint to one neighborhood, throw a grenade, and fire a burst from his submachine gun. Then, he would run 3 blocks over, throw another grenade, and fire a burst from a different weapon. He was creating a symphony of chaos. To the Germans listening in the dark, it didn't sound like one guy. It sounded like an invading regiment. Whenever he encountered a patrol, he didn't just kill them. He would ambush them, kill the leader, and then capture the rest. But instead of keeping them, he would escort them to the edge of the city and tell them, "Get out. Tell your friends the Canadians are here. Tell them we have 1,000 men and we are burning everything." He released them on purpose. He weaponized their fear. These terrified German soldiers ran back to their commanders and reported that a massive army was swarming the city. Panic began to spread like a virus through the German ranks. For 8 straight hours, Léo Major ran a marathon of destruction. He was everywhere at once. At one point, he stumbled upon the local SS headquarters. Most men would avoid that building like the plague. Léo kicked the door in. He engaged the officers inside, killed 4 of them in a close-quarters gunfight, and then set the building on fire. The sight of the Gestapo headquarters engulfed in flames was the final straw. It lit up the night sky like a beacon of defeat. The Germans, seeing their command center burning and hearing explosions all over the city, broke. They believed the lie. They believed they were overrun. The order was given to retreat. Throughout the night, Léo kept moving. He was exhausted. His body was screaming. But he forced himself to visit nearly every German position he could find, firing, throwing grenades, and screaming commands to an imaginary platoon behind him. By 4 a.m., the streets were eerily quiet. The gunfire had stopped. The Germans were gone. As the sun began to rise over Zwolle, the townspeople cautiously opened their doors. They expected to see tanks. They expected to see battalions of soldiers. Instead, they saw one man. He was covered in mud. His face was black with soot. He had an eye patch, and he was walking down the middle of the street, utterly exhausted. Léo Major found a member of the Dutch resistance and told him simply, "The city is free." He didn't wait for a parade. He didn't wait for applause. He had one last thing to do. He went back to the outskirts of the city, to the railroad tracks where the night had begun. He picked up the body of Wilfred Arsenault. He carried his friend back to the now liberated city, ensuring that Wilfred was the first Canadian reinforcement to enter Zwolle. He had saved 50,000 people. He had saved the historic buildings. He had done the impossible. And he had done it all for his friend. You would think that after liberating a city single-handedly, a man would retire. You would think he had seen enough war. But Léo Major wasn't done yet. The world was about to change, and a new war was brewing in the east. And believe it or not, the one-eyed pirate had one more miracle left in him. After World War II ended, Léo Major tried to do what millions of other men did. He tried to go home. He returned to Montreal, took off the uniform, and tried to settle into a normal life. He got a job, he got married, he had kids. For 5 years, the man who had liberated a city single-handedly was just another face in the crowd, carrying a lunch pail to a construction site. But for a man like Léo, peace is a difficult thing to navigate. The silence of civilian life can be louder than the shelling. So, when the Korean War broke out in 1950 and the call went out for experienced veterans to volunteer, Léo didn't hesitate. He dusted off his boots. He put the eye patch back on. The one-eyed pirate was going back to work. If you think Léo slowed down because he was older, you are dead wrong. In fact, Korea is where he cemented his status as a tactical genius. In November 1951, Léo found himself at the base of Hill 355. The soldiers called it Little Gibraltar because it was steep, rocky, and strategically vital. Whoever held that hill controlled the entire valley. It was the kind of position that armies bleed to death over. The hill had been held by a massive American unit, but they had been overrun by a relentless Chinese assault. The Americans were pushed off the summit in a chaotic retreat, leaving the hill in enemy hands. The Canadian commanders looked at the situation and realized they had to take it back, and they had to take it back fast. So, who do you send when you need to retake a fortress against overwhelming odds? You send Léo Major and a specially selected platoon of scouts and snipers. Léo didn't charge up the hill screaming. He did what he always did. He used the night. He and his men crept up the icy slopes of Hill 355 in absolute silence. They slipped past the enemy pickets, infiltrated the trenches, and opened fire before the Chinese soldiers even knew they were there. In a matter of hours, Léo Major had recaptured the hill that a whole battalion had lost. But taking the hill was the easy part. Holding it was the nightmare. The Chinese military was furious. They launched a counterattack that was described by witnesses as a human wave. We are talking about 2 entire divisions, approximately 14,000 soldiers, surging toward Léo's position. Léo had about 18 men with him, 18 men against 14,000. By any tactical calculation, Léo and his men were already dead. The Canadian command ordered him to retreat. They told him it was suicide. They told him to give up the ground. Léo Major got on the radio and, true to his character, politely told his superiors to go to hell. He refused to retreat. As the enemy wave crashed over the trenches, the fighting became hand-to-hand. It was brutal, primal combat. Bayonets, knives, rocks. Léo was right in the middle of it, directing his men, firing his weapon, and holding the line by sheer force of will. And then, he made the call that legends are made of. Realizing that his position was being overrun, Léo grabbed the radio handset. He contacted the mortar platoon stationed at the bottom of the hill. He gave them a set of coordinates. The mortar captain on the other end hesitated. He looked at his map and realized that the coordinates Léo gave were literally on top of Léo's own position. "Captain!" Léo yelled over the radio. "Drop the shells on me! It's the only way to clear them off!" It is a military term called danger close, but this was beyond danger close. This was insanity. Léo Major called down a rain of high-explosive mortar fire onto his own head. He ordered his men to take cover in the deepest bunkers they could find, and he let the artillery do the rest. The explosions shattered the hill. The Chinese assault was broken. For 3 days and 3 nights, the attacks continued, and each time, Léo repelled them. When the smoke finally cleared, Léo Major was still standing. He had held Little Gibraltar. For this action, Léo was awarded a bar to his Distinguished Conduct Medal. This is a crucial detail. In the entire history of the British Commonwealth, Léo Major is the only Canadian soldier to ever receive the DCM in 2 separate wars. He was quite literally in a league of his own. After Korea, Léo finally hung up his rifle for good. He returned to Canada and disappeared back into obscurity. He spent the next few decades working as a pipe fitter, fixing toilets and welding joints. Most of his neighbors had no idea that the old man with the eye patch living next door was a double war hero who had commanded the respect of generals and the fear of empires. But while Canada may have forgotten him for a while, Zwolle never did. For 40 years, the people of Zwolle told the story of the mysterious liberator to their children. They taught it in schools, and eventually, they went looking for him. In the 1970s, they found him in Montreal. They invited him back to the Netherlands. When Léo arrived in Zwolle, he wasn't greeted as a tourist. He was greeted as a savior. Thousands of people lined the streets. the same streets he had run through with a machine gun in 1945. But this time, they were cheering. Old men and women who had been children during the war wept openly when they saw him. They touched his face. They hugged him. They named a street after him, Léo Major. They made him an honorary citizen. For the rest of his life, Léo visited Zwolle regularly, and he always said that his bond with the Dutch people was the greatest medal he ever received. Léo Major passed away in 2008 at the age of 87. He died peacefully in a hospital bed, a stark contrast to the violence that had defined his youth. So, the next time you watch a superhero movie or play a video game where one soldier takes on an entire army, just remember, it's not always fiction. Sometimes, reality is stranger and braver than anything Hollywood can dream up. There was a man who lost an eye and refused to quit. A man who bluffed an army. A man who saved a city. His name was Léo Major. And he was the one-eyed ghost who walked through fire and came out the other side smiling. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story of absolute grit, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, do you think Léo was the bravest soldier of the 20th century? Or just the craziest? I'll see you in the next one.